Tonight, a big battle over national security as a controversial provision of the Patriot Act expires. The NSA's ability to collect phone records, it's gone, at least for now. And we all have, believe it or not, Rand Paul to thank or to blame. Then our discussion with Barney Frank, the former Massachusetts congressman. He's got a whole lot to say about gay marriage, the culture wars, and yes, even Hillary Clinton. Then the war of words between Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio just keeps escalating, and now it's getting even more personal. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. We're going to get into all that, plus a really interesting conversation, easy for me to say, about the politics of sex on campus and acknowledgement and how this all works. We'll get into that later on in the program. But we start with that controversial NSA surveillance program that expired at midnight last night. And in a rare Sunday session, the Senate, they failed to reach a deal that would have continued some provisions of the Patriot Act. That includes the NSA's bulk collection of phone records of Americans. Rand Paul, he ended up, even if it was all showmanship, whatever it was, at the end of the day, he successfully blocked a proposed 2-week extension to the legislation. And he had this to say to his opponents.
People here in town think I'm making a huge mistake. Some of them, I think, secretly want there to be an attack on the United States so they can blame it on me.
We'll talk about that. But Senate Majority Leader and fellow Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell, fellow Republican, he couldn't hide his frustration with Senator Paul.
We shouldn't be disarming unilaterally as our enemies grow more sophisticated and aggressive. And we certainly should not be doing so based on a campaign of demagoguery and disinformation.
Now, this is turning into a civil war within the Republican Party and also raising a lot of questions about everything from privacy and security. Let's bring in our panel to figure this all out. Jeannie Zaino, professor of political science at Iona College and professor of campaign management at NYU. Dominic Carter, back from his long weekend here, political journalist and author. Scott Levinson, president of the Advance Group, and Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. Okay, Jeannie, I start with you. Whether it was he's a presidential candidate, he's trying to get some free press, or whatever it was, you have interesting elements to this debate. You have the libertarian senator, Rand Paul, at war with his own Republican colleagues over this, and obviously there's the parliamentary part of this where he can hold it by himself, basically this. And then you've got the progressives on the Democratic side who aren't crazy about some of the elements of the Patriot Act, but then the majority of the Democrats who still say this is better than the alternative. It's a whole jumbled political mix here, but one guy took it off the rails.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, what's interesting is you look at the issue of effectiveness. I think all Americans want there to be an ability of the American government to fight terrorism. Yet the NSA spying program has not been effective. The NSA itself has said, we will remove this. It was only looking at landlines. It wasn't even addressing the issue of cell phones. So that is not something that most people think is effective. And yet there's 2 other provisions that were impacted by the non-decision, which is the lone wolf, for instance. You know, can you catch a lone wolf? And so there are other aspects of this that I think are worth paying attention to. And those are, you know, for a few days at least, and I think the USA Freedom Act is going to get passed eventually in the Senate, perhaps. Those, at least for a few days, are off the rails because of this. But I do think the issue of effectiveness is something that for everything Rand Paul is doing, and I appreciate the fact that he's focused so much on our, you know, our issues of civil liberties, is not looking at the issue of effectiveness. And I think, in my sense, it feels a bit self-aggrandizing in terms of what he's been doing.
I think a whole lot of it. But Dom, to me, listen, we'll get into the policy part for a second, what could or couldn't be done. But I thought there was a whole lot of posturing here by a guy who wanted to get some free press.
No.
But the consequence is, you know, I have huge problems with elements of the Patriot Act. I think how it was done, how it was implemented, I think we've given over huge swaths here of privacy and liberties that maybe aren't necessary without checks and balances. On the same end, I don't want Rand Paul deciding national security for me, right? And there were certain elements that could have easily been passed that weren't the controversial parts for another couple of weeks. He held even those up. So I understand there's the message, but there's also the messenger that I can't get out of this conversation.
I prefer on a personal level. I heard the professor in which she says it has not been effective. I understand that and I respect that. But I think most Americans will share the sentiment that I have. I'd rather have the reassurance that at least we know that everything that is possible that may protect us is actually in place. And I just want to point this out, Richard. Remember the attack on the garage in Manhattan, the first terrorist attack, the bomb. Many years later came 9/11. Just keep that in mind. You have people, I see Scott is itching to respond.
Andrew, too, he's on the table.
But
Yeah.
I can handle both of them. But But you have people, I like that. But you have people that are just waiting, Richard, for an opportunity. The lone wolves, which maybe you can't stop. They're just waiting.
Listen, fear is a tremendous motivator, and it's a real problem when you start governing that way. It's maybe 15, 20 years ago, we were actually debating how many red light cameras to have in our state. And Dominic remembers the debate as a violation of civil liberties. We don't raise any of those privacy questions anymore, and it's almost like we've given up that turf.
So wait,
because
that was a
we've
good
given
thing,
up.
right?
We've given up. We've given up.
I mean, the red lights and the cameras on. I thought that was a good thing.
I actually think the red light cameras are not a violation of civil liberties because it's a discrete use of technology for a specific crime. I think it's the far-reaching nature of the Patriot Act that opens up so much of our personal communications for the security arms of our government that it's just time that someone, and I think it's actually, I think it's easy to target Rand Paul, but the Democrats in their effort not to lose the flag as an issue have gone so far to not even address some of the civil liberties issues you addressed.
But Andrew, one of the things that was brought up was, well, who should, in the collection of the data, who should get it? And there's almost a collective shrug from a lot of Americans that says, whether it's the phone company or whether it's the U.S. government, what's the difference? They got it anyway. So in this fight that we're going to have here, and it's certainly not over because of what didn't get done on Sunday, what are the battle lines that we're really fighting over?
Well, I think it's whether the government controls the data or whether they're held by the phone company, and whether warrants are going to be required, whether additional warranting is going to be required. But this all falls into my larger point with all this, which is we've never really had that debate about the trade-off between private security and public safety. And we've talked about it on this program before that we haven't had that debate. And we talked several months ago about the deadline for the Patriot Act coming up and said, well, this ought to prompt the debate that we never had 14, 15 years ago. And we still haven't had that debate. And criticize Rand Paul all you want, but he's been very consistent on this from the very beginning. And if he's going to use everything in his power to delay it, that's certainly his right to do so.
So collectively, is our concerns more in looking at the effectiveness or non-effectiveness of the Patriot Act that it's too overreaching, or that it just isn't effective? At the end of the day, they gather it all, but they just they're not able to cull it down enough, or there's too much stovepiping, whatever it is, or is it that they're going too far?
My issue is that we haven't had a debate about effectiveness. Look at the NSA program, by the NSA's own admission, has not captured one terrorist. Not one. And so you need to have a debate about effectiveness. And I appreciate Rand Paul bringing up the issue of civil liberties, but quite frankly, this is all about Rand Paul. It should be about the American public. And it
so you're less
about
concerned about overreach than you are more about effectiveness.
No, I'm concerned about effectiveness. I'm concerned about, if this is saving us from a terrorist attack, that's fine. If it's not, tell us.
I don't know if these are actually mutually exclusive. I think as you get to what's effective and really cull down to the details of what you're looking for, you force the government to be more specific, and you force the legislation to be more specific. And in that way, I think you'll get to some of the effectiveness Jeannie's talking about. I think we're setting up a little bit of a false choice between one or the other.
See, for me, I think Andrew's right. I think everybody's right. We never had this debate, but national security letters, if the public knew what those things are and the power that the government has to use these, they can go right now, legal, this is not part of the Patriot Act, and they basically can say, you know what, I want to go to Dominic's employer, to his bank, to his phone company, to his library, gather all the information, all without a subpoena, and they have to all give it over, or they could be basically subject to their own possible prosecution if they're not cooperative, and he never even knows. That's still okay. So some of these fights I think we're having, although important and necessary, I mean, the cat's out of the bag on this one. To me, it's almost prove they're effective or don't do it. Then, fight about whether they can or can't do it.
But you're fighting an enemy that does not believe in rules and will do anything.
But didn't we, without sounding like an after-school special, didn't we also say we didn't want to be like them? So didn't we want to also have a distinction between our society and culture and theirs?
No. But what the civil liberties folks? Excuse me.
Are there lines for you?
Yes, but I believe our security outweighs everything.
All lines.
Well, you'd have to give me a specific one. But I mean, think about this, Richard. I mean, no offense, but the civil liberties folks, they scream bloody murder about cameras being out on the street. Now they're so effective, criminals have a hard time getting away with something because cameras pick up almost everything that you do.
And that gets to the question of effectiveness. If it's not effective, what's the point? I agree with you if it's not effective, but we have not yet had any debate about effectiveness of the NSA program.
And to Dominic's point, I think why that fight over cameras in the streets has been lost is because people generally recognize that there's no expectation of privacy when you're walking down a public street. That's not true with people's phone conversations.
Good point. But I mean, I just look at it, Richard. If you have nothing to hide, what's the big deal? I mean, if you have nothing to hide, what is the big deal?
You dropped that just I had to go to break.
Of course, that's why.
Man,
that's why.
Man, we could have a whole hour on that
He's
one.
having a heart attack over
All
there.
right.
He'll be okay.
Well, he'll yell him in the break. All right. We want to get you involved in our conversation, and I'm sure Dominic probably has got already a few comments coming. Go to Facebook and Twitter and answer a question. As it relates to the Patriot Act rollback, can we have privacy and protection at the same time? And where are your lines here? We know Mr. Carter's. All right, coming up next, they are at it again. Bill de Blasio sniping at Andrew Cuomo, and the governor not exactly taking that line down. But while they're arguing, are the people of New York actually suffering from some of the consequences with these two guys? We'll be right back with more on that.